On this episode of Newt's World, Dylan Mulvaney, a transgender influencer, partnered with Bud Light in a sponsored Instagram video on April 1st, 2023. The video promoted a $15,000 giveaway during March Madness. The partnership sparked a huge backlash and a boycott of Bud Light. Just days later, singer Kid Rock used several cases of Bud Light for target practice, opening fire on them with a gun in response to the news that Anheuser-Busch made a transgender woman a Bud Light spokesperson. The fallout was a drop in Bud Light sales and a shakeup of the U.S.-based marketing team and other executives. I'm really pleased to welcome my guest, Anson Frericks, former president of Anheuser-Busch Sales and Distribution. His new book is Last Call for Bud Light, The Fall and Future of America's Favorite Beer. And I have to say, it is a great title. Anson, welcome, and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
Oh, thanks for having me, Newt. Really excited to be here.
You've mentioned that your earliest memory of Anheuser-Busch was watching their Super Bowl commercial in 1989 when you were 5 years old. What made that moment so impactful for you, and was there something about the brand or the commercial that left a lasting impression on you at such a young age?
Well, I think there were two things that left a lasting impression. First off, from Cincinnati, Ohio. So I'm a Cincinnati Bengals fan. And that was the year you had the Cincinnati Bengals, Boomer Esiason, playing Joe Montana in the Super Bowl. So my parents had a big party that year. And then the other thing that made it more memorable is that was the first year that you had the Bud Bowl. And if you remember, this is when you had Budweiser versus Bud Light. They had cans of beer. They were competing against each other.
Football fans, get ready for the battle of the century. As unbeaten Budweiser takes on undefeated Bud Light. It's Bud versus Bud Light in Bud Bowl 1. Bud Bowl 1. This time, it's for real.
It was the first time ever that actually a company had run a Super Bowl ad specifically about the Super Bowl, just for the Super Bowl as well. And it was a big deal where consumers, they could predict the score of the Bud Bowl and they could win free beer and money afterwards. So it was a huge success for the company, and really is what ignited Bud Light sales to become the largest beer brand in the country, was that commercial campaign. It was amazing how Bud Light really became an extraordinarily successful brand. Amazing successful brand. If you think about it, almost the height of beer and beer marketing was the decade that followed. It was the 90s and it was the early 2000s. You probably remember there was the Budweiser Frogs commercial.
Budweiser. Budweiser. Budweiser.
There was the Bud Light Real Men of Genius commercials.
Real Men of Genius.
Real Men of Genius.
Today we salute you, Mr. Footlong Hot Dog Inventor.
Mr. Footlong Hot Dog Inventor.
When conventional wisdom said no one could make a hot dog longer than 6 inches, you dared to dream.
Dared to dream.
You knew the limitations of a regular-sized hot dog bun, and you ignored them.
Can't stop me now.
You made a 10-inch wiener, and people cheered.
Oh.
But you weren't satisfied. You said, wait, I think I can still give you 2 more inches.
Gotta want it.
So this Bud's for you, Mr. Hot Dog Hero, because you gave every single one of us our fondest wish, a bigger wiener.
There was the What's Up guys from Budweiser, and that was really the pinnacle.
What's up?
Yo, who's that?
Yo, pick up the phone.
Hello? What's that?
What's up?
Beer sales peaked in the U.S. in the early 2000s, I think partly because of the genius of some of these marketing campaigns that just made kind of beer part of American life. It was part of sports, it was part of music.
So after your 5-year-old experience, as you were growing up, what did Budweiser represent to you?
I mean, I don't know. To me, it was always like Budweiser was America in a bottle. I mean, it was Clydesdales, it was sports, it was backyard barbecues. It brought people together. And that beer was always something that was never really partisan. People were Democrats, Republicans, black, white. I mean, everyone was drinking beer. And it was usually people were having a good time and people were having fun. So to me, that's kind of what the brand represented.
Now, as I understand it, You were collecting, and as a kid now, before you can even drink, you're collecting memorabilia like neon signs, steins, vintage cans. I mean, I have this image of your bedroom as sort of a shrine to Anheuser-Busch.
That's kind of what it was. I mean, God bless my mom. I think she thought that was better than me drinking the product when I was that age. So she said, okay, I'll have the neon signs and the blow-ups and the kind of pin tackers on the wall. My childhood bedroom, I mean, it really looked like a sports bar because I thought that was fun. That was cool. They did great marketing. And I think at the lunch table, I don't know, in junior high and high school, if you knew the latest Bud Light catchphrases of, what's up or Real Men of Genius, I don't know, bought you some social currency. So I thought it was kind of cool.
See, I have this image of you as sort of a walking Anheuser-Busch fan. How did your friends react to that?
Yeah, I don't know. There was this big study that was done, and I remember it. I don't know. It showed that I graduated from high school in 2002. And funny enough, apparently that was the year that underage drinking peaked in the United States. And I don't know if that had to do with the success of the marketing of the brand. That wasn't really who they were supposed to target in the 90s and early 2000s. But I just think that at that time, beer was cool, Budweiser was cool, Bud Light was cool. They kept winning all these Super Bowl ad meter awards. Super Bowl's coming up this week. And the biggest honor of a marketer or brander is this USA Today, where they take the pulse of the entire country and the entire country ranks what are their favorite Super Bowls. I mean, Anheuser-Busch, Bud and Bud Light were winning them almost every single year at this time. So they just really understood sort of the customer, the culture, where the country was. And I think I was probably just similar to a lot of guys growing up that, I don't know, when you got to a certain age, you thought, hey, I'll be able to drink some Buds and Bud Lights and hang out with my buddies and have some fun and good times. So I don't know. That was the culture I grew up in.
I have to ask, do you still have your Budweiser frog figurines?
Oh, I got them somewhere down my parents' basement, I think. My mom saved all this memorabilia and all the stuff that I had from my childhood bedroom. So it's all down in the basement somewhere. I'm still trying to convince my wife to let me figure out a room in my house to put all that stuff up, but haven't convinced her yet.
You could someday open up a Bud Light museum.
I probably could at some point, yeah, with all the stuff that I have. That's the dream at some point. If the book does well enough, maybe we'll do that.
As a kid, you really were fascinated with Bud Light, and then you make the transition and you actually go to work for them. I mean, what was that transition like?
Yeah, it was interesting. Even though I grew up liking Bud Light, liking the company, liking the commercials, I never thought I would end up working there. After undergrad, I went and I worked at a private equity firm out of Boston, and I went back to business school. And I was in business school working at a hedge fund in New York City when I ran into some folks at Anheuser-Busch InBev. And they had moved their global headquarters to New York really after buying Anheuser-Busch in the U.S., and it was a couple of folks from 3G Capital. They were really the owners of Anheuser-Busch InBev now in New York. And after running into them, we're at a bar in New York, they convinced me to come work for what they said was kind of the world's largest private equity firm that happened to sell beer. And so given my kind of background in finance, but given my sort of enjoyment of the products, I thought it could be kind of a potentially match made in heaven. They sold me that this company was a meritocracy, that you could grow quickly in the organization, that the company had future plans to grow. They were going to go buy brands, Grupo Modelo in Mexico and SAB Miller, who knows, maybe buy other big companies, Pepsi down the line. So that was exciting. And so they convinced me to join them in the year 2011 is when I joined the company. Actually, I originally joined them in Belgium in a finance job and then moved to St. Louis and New York and Denver and Atlanta. So moved a bunch of times over my 11-year career with them.
In 2008, Anheuser-Busch, which had been a classic American company, and I'd spent time over the years with Augie Busch, it was acquired in a hostile takeover by InBev, which was a smaller but very aggressive Belgian-based company. Can you sort of walk us through that kind of experience? What was it like seeing your company go through such a dramatic transition?
I joined just a couple years afterwards. So a lot of these people that were around from, call it the Augie Busch and the Busch family days, and who had really built Anheuser-Busch into what it had become. It had become the largest kind of beer company in the world behind the success of Bud and Bud Light. And they did it by great marketing, branding. That was their specialty. But then a company called InBev, which was Belgian-based, kind of run by a group of Belgian and then Brazilian families. They had a different philosophy than Anheuser-Busch did. And their philosophy was really they were more cost-cutting. They employed a philosophy called zero-based budgeting, which was kind of the antithesis of what Anheuser-Busch was and how Anheuser-Busch built the business off great branding. InBev, they would come in, they'd cut the cost. And, candidly, in mid-2000s, there were a lot of costs to cut at Anheuser-Busch. I think the company owned 8 helicopters at the time. They owned, a fleet of jets. They owned SeaWorld. They owned Busch Gardens. There were a lot of just kind of non-core beer assets they had picked up over time. So, unfortunately, the company got a little bit bloated and they became susceptible to a takeover as the Busch family did not have a lot of stock in and the stock price hadn't moved in a number of years. So they were taken over by a competitor, InBev, in 2008 and 2009.
How did that change the company's culture?
Yeah, I mean, it changed the company's culture dramatically. I think that the InBev organization, when they came in, of course, immediately did away with sort of the private jets, did away with the helicopters, did away with $1,000 expense dinners. I mean, there was a lot of excess that went away. So some of that was good, because if you're a business and you just get bloated and you are wasting money and you're not necessarily investing the right way, some of that's positive. I would say the negative things that changed about the organization was really sort of the hiring, I think, specifically Americans that were really from the geographical center of the country that really understood their customer. That was one of the biggest shifts that happened. InBev brought in a lot of their marketers that were from Belgium or that were from China or that were from sort of overseas that didn't really understand the U.S. customer. And they also didn't invest as much into marketing and building brands as Anheuser-Busch did. They thought that these kind of brands could just last forever and that people would continue to buy them. But as we know, you have to continue to invest into brands. You have to continue to have the pulse of the country. And I think that was probably the biggest disconnect is it went from a marketing organization to a financial organization, and that can only produce value for so long.
Historically, weren't brands like this that were national brands, weren't they basically represented locally by locally owned companies that were doing the marketing and had the network of personal relationships? And if I remember correctly, Cindy McCain's father was a big Budweiser distributor in Arizona. Did InBev change that kind of locally controlled distribution system, or did they just use it as it existed?
They used it as it existed where they legally had to. But in terms of how the alcohol system works, it's actually pretty interesting. There's known as a 3-tier system where legally you have manufacturers of alcohol like Anheuser-Busch. They have to sell to independent third-party wholesalers that are family-owned in every county across the U.S. And then those wholesalers have to sell to independent bars and restaurants and liquor stores and others. And unfortunately, when InBev came in, they kind of turned this system upside down. Historically, the old Anheuser-Busch and the Busch family had worked with these wholesalers, these distributors. They were great partners, equal partners. But then when InBev came in, they tried to start buying up all of these family-owned businesses across the U.S. And they thought that there was a problem with these independent family-owned businesses. They weren't running their business as well. They didn't understand how to market. And I think that was a completely misnomer. Anheuser-Busch tried to more steer from the center. I mean, they almost had, it was almost like a communist party way of controlling the system where they tried to steer from what they called steer from the center, dictate all marketing from one location, as opposed to letting their independent wholesalers across the country be able to market to what people wanted to see in Phoenix versus New York versus Boston. So you mentioned, great wholesaler families. The McCain family, they own the wholesalership in Arizona. Andy McCain, great person, great historic partner. But then when you have this other organization trying to come in, buy your business or tell you what to do, there's obviously a reaction to that. It was a tough relationship early on between InBev and their local wholesalers.
Now, you also mentioned that the decay of Bud Light really occurred over about a 15-year period with lots of relatively small decisions, but they accumulate. What did you mean by that?
The one thing we just spoke about, fraying those distributor relationships was a big part of this, where historically there was trust between Anheuser-Busch and their wholesalers. They worked together. It was a great symbiotic relationship, but they started fraying that partnership. Another thing that really made the distributors lose trust in Anheuser-Busch was Anheuser-Busch moved the sales and marketing headquarters of the company, which had always been based in St. Louis, Missouri. Kind of the geographical center of the country, very close to Peoria, Illinois. And there's a great saying in marketing that if it plays in Peoria, it generally plays across the country. So in St. Louis, there was just a way to, within a 50-mile radius of St. Louis, you have urban areas, you have rural areas, you have suburbs, you have farms. It was a great way to kind of understand your brands and who buys them. It's a very high share market as well. But in the 2015-2016 time period, the company, they moved their marketing headquarters from St. Louis to New York City. When they did that, they hired different agencies that were more in New York. They hired different people that had only lived in New York City their entire lives. And those people, they're seeing even how you sell beer in New York City is very different than you do in the rest of the country. In New York City, you don't have any Walmarts. You don't have really any big kind of convenience store chains. You don't have any Chili's or bars and restaurant chains like that. It's just very different. And then so a lot of these changes really added up, where you had fraying relationships with wholesalers. You changed the geographic place where your sales and marketing team was. You're hiring different individuals. And then you sort of adopted different philosophies as well. One really around these policies of ESG and DEI, which the company had really never subscribed to historically, but because they were owned by Europeans, and this was was more of a European philosophy of how businesses should act. There were a lot of kind of small changes that added up and ended up culminating in this partnership with Dylan Mulvaney.
If I remember correctly, many of the great national beer brands came out of the Midwest.
They did. You're right. Think about it. Miller was out of Milwaukee. Pabst is out of Milwaukee.
I guess you could argue Youngling in Pennsylvania, but it's in Western Pennsylvania. It's not in Philadelphia. But there was a sense that, of course, beer had been, to a great degree, a German product, and the Germans had migrated into that whole region. But I can tell you, being married to somebody from Wisconsin, there is a Midwestern style and rhythm that has no relation to New York City.
You're exactly right. This is a different way of life. There's different philosophies. And I don't know, I think beer more plays towards that laid back, sitting around in a cul-de-sac, you mow your lawn and you want to have a beer afterwards. That doesn't really play well in New York. New York is more of a fast paced and cocktail bars and high end. It's a different philosophy, a different mentality, a different vibe, a different lifestyle, and frankly, a different customer in a lot of cases.
I talked at one time with the Guinness people. And they said they had realized that Guinness essentially is bought to sit and talk to people. And so they were opening up all these Irish bars because people would not buy Guinness to go home and drink alone. But they'd go to the bar. Totally different culture. And of course, you're producing a beer that is perfect for watching baseball or football or basketball. I mean, it's sort of a sports beer, if you will.
That's it. Lager beers specifically, they're supposed to be sessionable. With lagers, that's the beer that you drink a couple of them hanging out with friends over the course of a game, which is different than an IPA or kind of like a different beer. You might only have one or two of them. Bud Light, it became one of the largest beers because it was sessionable and because it was sociable and because it brought folks together.
They make a decision, which I had never seen put in context into your book, but in 2016, they create the Bud Light Party, thinking it's going to bring people together, and then run ads guaranteed to drive people apart. It's a perfect example of elitist thinking with no understanding of the country they're talking to.
100%. And this was part of the problem. This was the same time when the company, they moved their headquarters from St. Louis to New York City. At the time, they had a Belgian who was running marketing for the company for the entire U.S. And then they had another Belgian person who was running marketing for Bud Light. And this is when you just have people that aren't from the U.S., don't culturally get the U.S., and they're trying to bring different values in. So they came up with this campaign called the Bud Light Party. And this was during the election of 2016, where Trump and Hillary are running. And they tried to sort of make a little bit of a parody out of the campaign by saying, essentially just vote for Bud Light. But even that campaign, a lot of those wholesalers, these independent wholesalers we were talking about, they were very much against this campaign. They didn't want Bud Light to get anywhere close to politics. And even who Bud Light hired to run that campaign, which was Seth Rogen and Amy Schumer, tend to be very progressive and they tend to be much more leftist. And the campaign itself, it was not a success at all. They started running even ads talking about how Bud Light, and they tried to make fun of it about gender equality and about LGBTQ rights and others, but it just didn't work because it was always seen that Bud Light was supposed to be funny and humorous, stayed as far away from politics. So they actually, after about 5 or 6 months, they canceled the campaign because it was performing so poorly and so badly. The person who was running Bud Light at the time was a Belgian guy. He ended up essentially getting fired from that job. But the company, of course, didn't learn its lesson, as 7 or 8 years later, they had an even worse campaign with the Dylan Mulvaney piece, but they should have taken their lessons at that time.
But I was surprised to read that when they ran the Bud Light Party, sales fell like 5% in the first half of the year. I mean, people were just rejecting it.
They were, exactly.
Why didn't that feedback suggest to leadership that maybe they were doing something wrong?
I think part of it is that in large organizations, especially with the move to New York City, you lost a lot of the loyalty to the company and there was a lot of employee turnover. When the company was based in St. Louis, people were there. They were lifers for St. Louis and you had a lot of longevity. Whereas when the company moved to New York City, you have people that can go and they can go work at Anheuser-Busch one week and then they jump to Facebook the next week and then Google the next week and then Banks and McKinsey. So turnover was incredibly high at this time. And so I almost think the company had really lost even sort of that muscle memory from even 7 years ago about what happened with the Bud Light Party campaign. And then really a lot of things had changed as well over the 7-year time period between 2016 and 2023, specifically in terms of more philosophically, Newt, about what is the purpose of a business and the purpose of a corporation. And historically in the United States, everyone had kind of abided by the Milton Friedman view of the world, that the purpose of a corporation is to serve its shareholders. How do you do that? You make great products and services. But especially after Trump was elected in 2016 and pulled out of organizations like the Paris Climate Accords, the World Health Organization, there was this real allergic reaction, especially from West Coast states that control a lot of money in pension funds, state of California, state of New York, a lot of European sovereign wealth funds, and they started putting a lot of pressure on business because they own shares in a lot of businesses to evolve and to adopt a broader view of capitalism known as stakeholder capitalism. And they essentially said, well, if Donald Trump and government's not going to fix existential crises of, you name it, climate change and systemic racism and all these other issues, that now business needed to solve these issues. And so there became a lot of pressure on businesses over the kind of that 7-year time period to get more involved in issues. And you saw sort of an uptick in companies getting involved in a lot of social and political issues. And I think that Anheuser-Busch was uniquely susceptible to a lot of these pressures, being a European-based company and abiding by this more European stakeholder capitalism model of business pushed by Klaus Schwab, World Economic Forum, and kind of the Davos crowd.
There's a very large block of Americans who love sports. And they love almost any kind of sport, whether you're talking about ultimate fighting or you're talking about baseball, soccer, hockey. That doesn't matter. They just like sports. Sports are inherently conservative because you get winners and losers. It's a meritocracy. You have to practice. Trump intuited, I think probably just because he liked it, long before he ran for president, he was totally immersed in sports. You know, he'd go to boxing in Las Vegas. At one point, he owned a football team. And I watched him just before the election go to the Ultimate Fighting Championship. I realized suddenly there were about 4 or 5 million young men who were watching that fight. And they were watching Donald Trump enjoying what they enjoyed, which is part of why I think he did so remarkably well with younger people, because they could feel together. Well, in a sense, it seems to me, that's the Bud Light market. I mean, the Bud Light market is the person who doesn't want to talk politics, and they don't want to be involved in fights in Washington. They want to enjoy life, have their favorite team or player or whatever, and relax. They go to sports to relax. They don't go to sports to have a political fight.
You know, Newt, if this doesn't work out for you, maybe you should be the next VP of Bud Light, because I think you get the customer more than others. You're right. And that's what was really a head scratcher to me, because in 2016, that was when actually Bud Light dropped these partnership with UFC that they had at the time. Because again, they had more of these Belgian marketers, European marketers coming in, and they wanted to switch the brand. And they switched the brand more towards being a little bit more politicized. This was silly to me, but over in Europe and Belgium, techno festivals were big, so techno music. So they canceled a lot of these partnerships and events with country music festivals and country music artists. With here in the US, people drink a ton of beer at country music festivals. That's the customer. You know, who doesn't drink a lot of beer is people who are going to techno festivals. They're doing, I don't know, Molly and drugs and everything else. And all of a sudden they were switching these. It just didn't make sense to people like myself that were from the US, from the Midwest. It made no sense. And to your point, beer is kind of a young person, especially males who drink it, very associated with sports. And UFC was becoming one of the most popular sports. It was very popular as well with Hispanics. And Hispanics are a big population that drinks beer. And you see some of the ascendancy of even Modelo, which passed Bud Light to be the number one beer. Modelo picked up that UFC sponsorship when Bud Light initially dropped it in 2016. And then Modelo went kind of through the roof at that time. And that's when you started to see Bud Light especially start to dwindle in its sales.
Historically, things like Corona were big. And now all of a sudden, you have Modelo, which just explodes. I think it's probably larger in America than all the other Mexican beers combined. It's remarkable.
Modelo is now the largest beer brand in the United States, which is interesting to think you actually have a Mexican beer that is the largest beer brand. But it goes back to your point. Again, who drinks a lot of beer? It's especially a bunch of young males that like sports. And there's a lot of Hispanics in this country that are young males and like sports, but there's even a lot of Caucasian and African American, Asian and others. Those are a lot of young males that like sports. And Modelo probably advertises more than Bud Light does on NFL. You see it on NFL, you see it at UFC.
Do you think the Belgians in the back of their mind sort of thought they could somehow evolve Bud Light so it was competing with Chablis and Chardonnay and the upscale crowd? Because a lot of their advertising only made sense if you were trying to actually compete with the white wine market.
You're right. And there's always this fallacy in the beer market that says, okay, we serve a lot of young men, but how do we get more, young women, or how do we get other people to drink more beer? And I think that's kind of somewhat silly. If you want to reach more of that crowd, go acquire a wine company, or go acquire a seltzer company, or do something different. But you want to let Bud Light be Bud Light, and you want to compete against Miller Lite and Coors Light and try and get more Miller Lite and Coors Light customers, because that's still the largest segment of the beer market, is that core domestic beer. Bud Light, Miller Lite, Coors Light combined dwarf any other sort of three beers in terms of market size and potential. And what's interesting about Miller Lite, Coors Light, Bud Light is that for most Americans, they're indistinguishable. 95% of people can't tell the difference between a Bud Light, Miller Lite, Coors Light, but what really distinguishes them is their brand.
So you're saying if you did a blind taste test with the three, it's very hard to figure out which one you're drinking?
Very hard. For 95% of Americans, they can't tell the difference. Now, there's a great 5% that have the right palate and like it enough, but for 95% of people, to them, a Bud Light, Miller Lite, Coors Light, they're almost indistinguishable. And you're really going to pick it based off the brand. I'm
curious. So they're in that sort of a rut, and suddenly they come up with Dylan Mulvaney. How far out of touch with the American reality do you think they had to be to think that would work?
You're out of touch enough that you lost millions of consumers. At this point, 40% of their sales. They're still down 40% versus where they were before this Dylan Mulvaney partnership. The stock, they've lost at least $2 billion worth of profits here in the U.S. The stock price is off by 40% since before they did this Dylan Mulvaney deal. And when the broader stock markets are up almost 40%. So to realize how out of touch not only they were to do the Dylan Mulvaney partnership, but I even think, Newt, the response was just as bad as the partnership itself, where the company was unable to clearly articulate what's the mission of Bud Light, who Bud Light is going to serve, what the brand stands for. They were almost caught between this rock and a hard place, where on one side, they were trying to figure out how not to lose any more of their core customers, just wanted Bud Light to stay out of politics. But there had been a ton of pressure over the last 4 or 5 years from the Biden administration, from big asset managers like BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard that were pushing an ESG and DEI agenda. There was, as I call it, the ideological industrial complex, consultancies that were pushing companies to become more about diversity, equity, and inclusion. A lot of organizations, nonprofits, and activists had popped up, like the Human Rights Campaign, that were pushing companies to get more involved in doing transgender affirmation care as part of healthcare policies and doing more specific advertisements to that community, and were penalizing companies if they weren't. So there was this whole complex that was putting a lot of pressure on organizations. And unfortunately, a lot of companies were participants. We saw Disney got involved in parental rights issues in Florida. You saw Target got involved in a bunch of issues. But Bud Light was really uniquely susceptible because they were this, down-home Midwestern brand, and its products were indistinguishable. And that's how out of touch they were, that it was very easy for consumers to walk away from Bud Light. Because anywhere you have a 6-pack of Bud Light, you also have that Coors Light and Miller Light. And for consumers, it's just as indistinguishable to pick one or the other.
What was the whole nature of the reaction of the American people to the Mulvaney ad?
The reaction was immediate and swift. And as you recall, this ad had happened on April 1st, so April Fool's Day. And a lot of people thought that this literally might be a joke because Dylan Mulvaney was a very controversial political figure. Dylan had just documented this 365 days of girlhood where she transitioned from a biological male to female. And over that time period had gone to the Biden White House, was advocating for gender affirmation care for youth with the Biden administration, was advocating for biological males to compete against women in sports. And these were all very controversial subjects, especially around this time. I think there were 25 bills that were in state houses around the time that were trying to ban gender affirmation care. There was also, if you recall, the week leading up to this, there was a mass shooting at a Christian school in Tennessee where there was a transgendered shooter that killed a number of folks in the school in Tennessee. So issues surrounding sort of transgender rights, transgender legislation, it was very, very topical at the time. And so when Bud Light all of a sudden seemed to come out and support this agenda agenda. And it was really never, again, a political brand. A lot of its customers revolted, said Kid Rock. I mean, that was be a Bud Light drinker. All of a sudden took out his AR-15 and shot up a bunch of cases. A bunch of country music stars kicked Bud Light off their tour buses. But then everyday folks as well started posting videos about them not buying Bud Light, about them throwing out Bud Light, about them going to the store, seeing that Coors Light and Miller Lite were out of stock, but Bud Light was in store. And this is when the American population, for the first time, actually organized a very successful boycott of a company. And they did this because it was just as easy to buy Miller Lite and Coors Light. And then every week, the sales data from Walmart and Kroger and 7-Eleven where beer is sold, it gets reported nationally, and people could see that sales were down of Bud Light 10% and 20% and 30%. So they were having an incredible impact on the sales of the brand, which kept the boycott going in a big way. And then there was continued fuel on the fire when the company, Anheuser-Busch, could not have a credible response to what was going on. They refused to either, again, apologize to their customer base, nor did they double down and say, no, Bud Light's going to be heading in a direction like maybe Ben & Jerry's. We're going to be more socially progressive, and we're going to be leaning into these. And because of that, they kind of took this middle ground, and they ended up getting shot at from both sides in this cultural war where they lost their traditional, more loyalist type of consumers, wanted to be apolitical, but then they lost a lot more of their progressive consumers as well that wanted them to be more socially liberal with their advertising.
You know, in the middle of this disaster, I mean, you do something that's pretty courageous. You write a letter to Brendan Whitworth asking that he step down as CEO. I mean, that takes a lot of guts.
Interesting enough, I had left Anheuser-Busch about a year before this happened because I saw a lot of the problems materializing at the company. The marketing had changed, their DEI, ESG policies had changed, they were struggling to find their consumer base. And so I left to actually start a company called Strive Asset Management with a buddy of mine from high school, Vivek Ramaswamy. And this was before he was running for president and doing Doge with Elon Musk. But the idea behind Strive was to keep companies out of politics and keep them focused on their mission and creating shareholder value. Then a year later, when Bud Light did this partnership with Dylan Mulvaney on April Fool's Day, and again, a lot of people thought it was a joke, and it wasn't. And the CEO, Brendan Whitworth, had multiple opportunities to course correct and to come out, clearly talk about this campaign. Was it a mistake or not? What's Bud Light's direction going to be? Had multiple chances to do it, didn't do it, could never clearly articulate. The stock price was down. I was still a big shareholder of the company. So I wrote a letter and just saying that Brendan is the CEO of the company, him being a fiduciary, him trying to act in the best interest of shareholders, he was failing people. And therefore, he needed to step down and let somebody else come back and be able to course correct and get the ship going back in the right direction.
Did you get any reaction?
I got a lot of reaction from the wholesaler partners at Anheuser-Busch. A lot of people reached out to me and said, hey, keep it up. Keep up what you're doing. You're the only person that is publicly advocating for policies that make a lot of sense. Because those wholesalers that we spoke about, the Andy McCain's in Arizona, they have a strong percentage of their business. I mean, 80 to 90% of their business, in a lot of cases, Anheuser-Busch. And when their largest brand, Bud Light, is down 30 and 40%, all of a sudden these guys are losing millions of dollars. They have to lay off a lot of their employees. There were a lot of suppliers also that had to shut down and close. Anheuser-Busch had to fire a lot of people. It became the poster child of really what went wrong with this whole ESG, DEI, very politicized movement in corporate America, where you just saw that these policies, not only did they not deliver any real value to shareholders, nor did they help make society better. If anything, they made it worse, and there were a lot of consequences. So a lot of those folks that got hurt were the ones that reached out and said, thank you for speaking up and saying something.
What do you think the future holds for Bud Light and for Anheuser-Busch?
Well, I still think that they have sort of choices to make. I'm a big advocate right now that I think the business is better off being sold here in the United States. So as we mentioned, InBev is this large corporation that it's the largest beer company in the world. They sell 1 out of 4 beers globally. They have big operations, not only here in the U.S. where they own Anheuser-Busch, but they own a bunch of beer brands in South America. Over in Europe, they own Stella Artois and Hoegaarden. In Africa, they own Carling and others. And I actually think right now the company is best served by actually selling the U.S. business, selling Anheuser-Busch Anheuser-Busch, whether it's selling it back to the Busch family or selling it to somebody like, I don't know, Warren Buffett and Berkshire Hathaway, and getting it really back in U.S. hands. And I think they need to first off go on a big sort of PR blitz and campaign about this. And I don't think they're really going to get any of their customers back until they do. Think about it. I mean, this would be an amazing comeback story. It's owned by Warren Buffett or somebody else. Say, hey, back in American hands, back in American values. This whole Bud Light thing was a mistake. Now we're getting back to serving our core customers. Here's how we're doing it. I think you could unlock an amazing amount of value. There'd be a ton of people that would come back to this company. But otherwise, I don't know how they recover. Because the other path that they've taken is they still haven't admitted any mistake for this Bud Light controversy. And really, I always say the path to redemption goes through forgiveness. But to be forgiven, you have to admit that there was a mistake that was made. Otherwise, no one's going to forgive you. And they refuse to admit there was a mistake. It's been almost 2 years now. So the people that are currently there, I don't think they can authentically do it. So they're going to either continue to kind of decline and have more of kind of a slow death in the U.S., or I think they sell the business and they can get right back on track very, very quickly. That's how I see this unfolding.
You reminded me, my younger daughter was an intern at Coca-Cola when they introduced New Coke. And the reaction was so hostile that within a very few weeks, the CEO had to go on television and give a speech and say, we made a mistake. We misunderstood. We're bringing back Coke. We apologize. And she was there for all of it. She was in charge of editing the Daily News, the volume they were getting of headline stories. She would call me and breaking up laughing and saying, these guys are in such trouble. But they recognize it and they reverse course.
They reverse course. They had a much better PR team and a crisis team that kind of got them out of that situation because they admitted there was a problem and there was a mistake.
Well, but it goes to your point about New York versus St. Louis. Because they were in Atlanta, one of the senior vice presidents said to me, they couldn't go to a cocktail party without people backing them into the wall and yelling at them. And about 3 weeks of that, they figured this is really not sustainable.
And I think that's what's tough is that when the company was based in now New York City and a lot of the executives are in New York City, they can't go to cocktail parties in New York City without saying, hey, why aren't you guys standing by Dylan Mulvaney? Or why aren't you guys doing more advertising? And the problem is that Bud Light was never a brand that was supposed to be like Ben & Jerry's. If you were Ben & Jerry's and Ben & Jerry's says, hey, we're a socially progressive brand. We use ice cream to advance, I mean, you name it, defund the police initiatives, overturning election integrity laws, the LGBTQ plus agenda. Man, like, it's a free country. Like, Ben & Jerry's can do that. That's their brand. But that's not the Bud Light brand. And that was the whole problem. I mean, I even think it's interesting now because I think this story is as relevant now as it really ever was. I mean, you've seen Trump has rolled back a lot of the DEI initiatives. Some companies already were going that direction because they saw these policies were divisive. Meta had rolled them back. Walmart had. McDonald's. But then other companies are doubling down. Costco, which is based in Seattle, is doubling down on the whole DEI agenda. JP Morgan, based in New York, is. So I still think that you're going to see a lot of controversy over the next couple of years about what are businesses supposed to do. And again, this book, I mean, Last Call for Bud Light, it tells sort of what do you do in these crises? What should companies do? What's going to be better for business and better for, I think, everyday citizens as well moving forward.
They have this tremendous drop, which is really stunning at the time. How much have they recovered since then?
So they haven't recovered at all since then. So sales in the weeks afterwards were down approximately 30%. That was in 2023. They were down almost 30%. In 2024, they were down another, I think, 10% on Bud Light. And to start this year, they continue to be down again.
Once your brand starts to sink, unless something dramatic happens, it becomes cumulative. And people say, well, that's not what I drink anymore.
That's it. It's not what I drink anymore. And then especially when the American population was really looking for their CEO to come out and to make a strong statement and talk about what Bud Light is. And he really had 3 opportunities to do it. The first time, about 2 weeks after the controversy, he released a statement where he neither acknowledged the controversy, why they were in the controversy, or how they were going to get out of the controversy. And they kind of had a patronizing ad of kind of a Budweiser running across the country. And it was panned across the country about saying, this is not how you handle a crisis. So sales continued to fall. A month later, there was another statement that it was also a nothing burger where it didn't admit mistake. And then there was a third opportunity where the CEO, Brendan Whitworth, had an opportunity to go on CBS. And he was on CBS going to July 4th weekend, which is the biggest beer selling holiday of the year. And he tried to right the ship, but he was very much coached going into this to not, again, address the controversy. And the CBS host asked him the first question was essentially, hey, knowing what you know now, would you do this campaign again or was it a mistake? And he gave a very wishy-washy, evasive answer. And the host came back and said, to be clear, you are in the problem in the situation you're in because of the answer you just gave, or you didn't answer the question. So let me ask it again, because the American population wants to know, was this a mistake? Would you do it again? And again, gave an evasive, wishy-washy answer. And ever since then, I mean, sales continue to decline, to suffer. That's when I wrote my op-ed saying, this is why you need to step down. This is not how you do crisis management. This brand's not going to come back. People are now moving on. And then you have a compounding issue where once the sales are down that much, Walmart, Kroger, 7-Eleven start taking your shelf space away. And then when they take your shelf space away, then it's very, very hard to get your sales back because you're out of stock.
Well, Anson, I want to thank you for joining me. Your new book, and I love the title, Last Call for Bud Light, The Fall and Future of America's Favorite Beer, is available now on Amazon and in bookstores everywhere. It's a fascinating read. We're going to feature a link to buy it on our show page. I'd really thank you for this extraordinarily interesting conversation.
Thank you so much for having me, Newt. I really appreciate it.
Thank you to my guest, Anson Frericks. You can get a link to buy his new book, Last Call for Bud Light, The Fall and Future of America's Favorite Beer, on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcasts and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.